What would you do if you discovered that one of the most revered figures in American history had a secret chapter so dark that it was deliberately erased from every official record? A night of bloody vengeance so complete that it was spoken of only in whispers among those who had suffered for generations? The humid air of Louisiana still holds secrets from the summer of 1866, when freedom came to one plantation not through proclamations or legislation, but through the edge of a blade wielded by a woman history remembers as a liberator, not an executioner. The scent of sugarcane still hangs heavy in the air around what remains of the Fontainebleau plantation, 20 miles outside New Orleans. The main house stands weathered but dignified, its white columns now stained with age, surrounded by the sprawling fields where hundreds once toiled under the lash. If you listen closely on still summer nights, locals claim you can hear the whisper of cane leaves rustling with something more than just the Gulf breeze. Some say it carries the echoes of that forgotten night, when 7 men met their end in ways so precise, so deliberately crafted, that it could only have been an act of calculated retribution. Before continuing this journey into one of history's most disturbing untold chapters, consider subscribing to join us for more hidden historical horrors that conventional textbooks dare not mention. On a sweltering July morning in 2022, Dr. Mybrie, Eleanor Meacham, a historian specializing in post-Civil War reconstruction, arrived at the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge. Her research on Emancipation celebrations had led her to New Orleans, where the first official Emancipation Day was scheduled for August 1, 1866. What began as routine academic research would soon lead her down a path of increasingly disturbing discoveries, challenging everything she thought she knew about one of America's most venerated historical figures. "I was simply looking for newspaper accounts of the celebration preparations," Dr. Meacham explained in her research notes. "The city was still recovering from the war, still deeply divided, and I wanted to understand how they navigated such a politically charged event." The archives were housed in a modern building with climate-controlled rooms that smelled faintly of old paper and preservation chemicals. As Meacham worked her way through boxes of newspapers and municipal records from the summer of 1866, she noticed repeated references to an incident at a plantation called Fontainebleau in the days leading up to the celebrations. The references were sparse, cryptic, with language that seemed deliberately vague. "Unfortunate incident causes delay in preparations for some Emancipation Day participants," read one article dated July 29th. Another from July 30th mentioned, "Authorities investigating disturbance at Fontainebleau estate. 7 casualties reported." Meacham's fingers trembled slightly as she continued through the materials. The temperature in the archive room seemed to drop, despite the summer heat outside. What she found next wasn't in any official report, but tucked between the pages of a plantation ledger. A folded letter written in a hurried hand. The ink faded to a rusty brown that Meacham would later discover was not ink at all. The letter was from a man named Thomas Whitley, who identified himself as an assistant to the plantation doctor at Fontainebleau. Dated July 29, 1866, it was addressed to his sister in Mississippi and never sent. Its contents would set Meacham on a 2-year investigation that would unearth a chapter of history deliberately obscured for over a century and a half. "Dearest Margaret," the letter began, "I write to you in great distress following events of last night which I can scarcely believe, though I witnessed the aftermath with my own eyes. 7 men, including Mr. Du Bois, the plantation manager, have been killed in manners so brutal and specific that I cannot help but see deliberate intent in each death. The authorities are calling it a coordinated uprising, but there is something more disturbing at work. The newly freed people seem more frightened than celebratory, and many whisper a single name when they think no one is listening: Moses. I fear this bloodshed is just the beginning." The letter continued with clinical descriptions of the 7 deaths, each corresponding to specific acts of cruelty the overseers had been known for. Meacham set the letter down, her academic interest now mingled with growing unease. The name Moses stood out to her immediately. It was the code name used for Harriet Tubman during her years with the Underground Railroad. But Tubman's documented activities after the Civil War involved suffrage advocacy and charity work. Could she have been in Louisiana during this period? And more disturbingly, could she have been involved in what appeared to be calculated acts of retribution? The temperature in the archive room felt even colder now as Meacham requested every available record connected to Fontainebleau Plantation for the years 1865 and 1866. What she discovered over the next several hours left her sitting motionless at her research table, surrounded by documents that told a story at odds with every historical account she had studied throughout her career. According to plantation records, Fontainebleau was owned by the Dubois family, French immigrants who had established one of the largest sugar operations in Louisiana before the Civil War. Unlike some plantation owners who fled during the conflict, the Dubois family had remained, and after the war, they had transitioned to a sharecropping system that many historians now recognize as hardly better than slavery itself. But what made Fontainebleau notorious, even among neighboring plantations, was the exceptional cruelty of its 7 overseers. The plantation records were meticulous, Meacham noted, not just about production and profits, but about punishments. They recorded every lash, every branding, every ear cut off or finger removed as punishment. They documented it like accountants tracking inventory, not as actions taken against human beings. The ledgers contained entries that made even the seasoned historian pause. One overseer, Jacques Martin, specialized in branding children who failed to meet cotton-picking quotas, marking their faces so they would carry their shame visibly for life, according to his own notes. Another, William Calhoun, had developed a method of drowning that would leave no marks on the bodies, which he employed against those caught attempting escape. The remaining 5 each had their specialties, their preferred methods of maintaining control through terror. But how did this connect to Harriet Tubman? Meacham expanded her search, requesting records from the Federal Freedmen's Bureau, which had been established to assist former slaves after emancipation. There, buried in a file of correspondence from field agents, she found a report dated June 12, 1866, mentioning that the operative known as Moses had been dispatched to investigate reports of continued enslavement and abuse at plantations around New Orleans, despite legal emancipation. The Bureau had received multiple reports that several plantations, Fontainebleau chief among them, were essentially operating as they had before the war. Dr. Meacham explained, workers were not permitted to leave, were not being paid as promised, and punishments continued. The federal government was stretched thin after the war, and the Freedmen's Bureau often relied on trusted operatives to investigate such claims. What happened next emerged from a patchwork of sources: fragments of journals kept by former slaves at Fontainebleau, verbal accounts later recorded by their descendants, and cryptic official reports that seemed deliberately vague. Tubman had arrived at Fontainebleau in early July, posing as an elderly domestic worker seeking employment. For 3 weeks she observed, she listened, she documented, and she planned. According to an account later provided by Martha Jenkins, who had been enslaved at Fontainebleau since childhood, Tubman gathered detailed information about each overseer, their habits, their quarters, and most importantly, the specific cruelties they had inflicted. She came to us as Mother Moses, Jenkins recalled in an oral history recorded in 1937 when she was in her 90s. She listened to our stories every night. She wrote nothing down, but her eyes, they remembered everything. When someone spoke of what Martin did to the children with his brand, her face never changed, but her hands would tighten just so. When we told her about Calhoun and his drownings, she would nod once, like she was making a promise. Jenkins's account, preserved in the archives of historically Black Hampton University, but never widely published, described how Tubman spent those weeks mapping the plantation grounds, learning the movements of the overseers, and secretly meeting with those who had suffered the most grievous abuses. What emerged was not a plan for escape, as had been Tubman's method during the war, but something far darker. She told us that true emancipation comes when the devil's workers can no longer do the devil's work. Jenkins' account continued. She said some chains can only be broken with the same force that forged them. The night of July 28, 1866, just days before the planned Emancipation Day celebrations, was moonless and heavy with humidity. According to multiple accounts collected by Meacham, Tubman moved through the plantation with a silence born from years of clandestine operations behind Confederate lines. But this time, she carried not guidance to freedom, but instruments of vengeance. The most detailed account of what happened that night came from a journal kept by Samuel Blackwell, one of the few literate former slaves at Fontainebleau. His writing, later preserved by his granddaughter who donated it to the Smithsonian in 1972, described how Tubman visited the quarters one final time before beginning her night's work. She came to us not as Moses that night, but as the angel of death from the old scripture, Blackwell wrote. She told us to stay in our cabins no matter what we heard. She said, "By morning, the 7 plagues of Fontainebleau will be lifted from you forever." What followed, according to Blackwell's account, was a night of methodical retribution. Tubman began with Jacques Martin, the overseer known for branding children. He was found the next morning in his quarters, his face bearing the mark he had inflicted on so many others, the stylized F for Fontainebleau that he had used to brand those he claimed as property. But unlike his victims, he had not survived the branding. William Calhoun, the drowning specialist, was discovered face down in the irrigation ditch he had used to end the lives of would-be escapees. His lungs were filled with the same muddy water that had claimed his victims, but marks on his body indicated he had been held there, conscious and struggling, until the last bubble of air escaped his lips. However, there was something even more disturbing about the precision of each death. Thomas Whitley's letter, which Dr. Meacham had discovered first, described how each of the 7 overseers had been killed in ways that perfectly mirrored their own acts of cruelty. Ambrose Pike, who had been known to whip women to death for minor infractions, was found flayed in his bed. The Dubois brothers, who worked as a team and were known for breaking the hands and feet of those who failed to meet quotas, were discovered with their own limbs shattered in identical patterns. The surgical precision described in these accounts is what troubles me most as a historian, Dr. Meacham noted. These were not acts of chaotic violence or spontaneous uprising. They show planning, knowledge of anatomy, and a disturbing attention to symbolic detail that speaks to a calculated mission of retribution. The local authorities arrived at Fontainebleau by mid-morning on July 29th. The official report, filed by Sheriff James Moreau and preserved in parish records, described the scene as a coordinated massacre perpetrated by person or persons unknown, likely former bondsmen seeking revenge. The report noted that none of the formerly enslaved workers claimed knowledge of the events, all stating they had remained in their quarters throughout the night. What the report did not mention, but what emerged from Meacham's broader research, was that no serious investigation ever took place. Within 2 days, the bodies were buried, the plantation temporarily closed, and the matter quietly set aside. The planned Emancipation Day celebrations in New Orleans proceeded on August 1st with no public mention of the events at Fontainebleau. But that discovery was only the beginning of the mystery that would consume Dr. Meacham's research. If Harriet Tubman had indeed carried out these acts, how had this chapter remained absent from every biography, every historical account of her life? The answer, Meacham discovered, lay in the deliberate efforts to suppress the story from multiple directions. There were powerful forces with vested interests in ensuring this story never came to light, Meacham explained. For white authorities in the Reconstruction South, admitting that a black woman had systematically executed 7 white men without capture or consequence was unthinkable. It would have undermined the entire racial hierarchy they were desperate to maintain even after legal emancipation. Equally significant was the silence from Tubman herself and those who documented her life. Tubman never spoke publicly about her activities in Louisiana, and her early biographers, many of whom were abolitionists concerned with presenting palatable narratives of black heroism to white audiences, omitted any mention of Fontainebleau. Tubman's image as Moses leading her people to freedom was politically useful for the abolitionist cause, Meacham noted. The image of Tubman as an avenging angel would have played directly into white fears of black violence and retribution. Even those who might have privately celebrated her actions would have recognized the danger in documenting them. As Meacham's research continued, she discovered additional evidence that strengthened the connection between Tubman and the Fontainebleau killings. A letter from Tubman to her friend and fellow abolitionist William Still, dated September 3, 1866, contained a cryptic reference. The work in Louisiana was completed as necessary, 7 devils cast out. We shall not speak of it again, but the Lord knows his justice was done. Still's reply, preserved in his papers at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, was equally guarded. I understand the necessity of the Louisiana matter and agree it is best left unrecorded. Some actions, while righteous before God, cannot be judged fairly by the laws of men. Your secret remains safe. The most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source, the personal journal of Frederick Douglass, which contained an entry from October 1866 describing a private conversation with Tubman. H.T. visited today and spoke in confidence of events in Louisiana this past summer. I find myself troubled not by the justice of her actions, which seem proportionate to the cruelties inflicted, but by the weight she now carries. She spoke of dreams in which she sees their faces, not in fear, but in certainty. I did not go to be their Moses, she told me, but their judgment. I worry for her soul, though she assures me it remains unburdened. She says she would do the same again tomorrow. This entry, found in a section of Douglass's papers that remained sealed until 1997, had largely escaped historical attention until Meacham's focused research. The timing aligned perfectly with Tubman's known movements in 1866, during which her whereabouts for approximately 6 weeks in the summer were previously undocumented, until one piece of the puzzle revealed the unthinkable: Harriet Tubman had not acted alone. As Meacham expanded her research to include military records from the period, she discovered that 3 former members of the Massachusetts 54th Infantry, one of the first African-American regiments in the Union Army, had been in New Orleans during July 1866. All 3 had served as scouts under Tubman during her time as a Union spy in South Carolina and had developed specific skills in clandestine operations. A report from a Freedmen's Bureau agent named Jonathan Pierce, dated August 10, 1866, noted, "Have confirmed that operatives Jackson, Williams, and Carver were present in the New Orleans region during the Fontainebleau incident. All 3 departed northward immediately after, traveling separately. Their involvement cannot be confirmed, but is strongly suspected." Military records showed that these 3 men had learned advanced combat techniques during specialized training for behind enemy lines operations. 1. Isaiah Williams had worked as a surgeon's assistant during the war and had extensive knowledge of anatomy. The skills of all 3 aligned perfectly with the calculated precision described in accounts of the Fontainebleau killings. What emerges is not the image of Tubman as a lone avenger, Dr. Meacham concluded, but as the leader of a small, highly trained team carrying out what they likely viewed as a military operation against continuing oppressors. This was not random violence, but a precisely targeted strike against specific individuals known for exceptional cruelty. The most haunting evidence came from a fragment of a letter written by Isaiah Williams to his wife in Philadelphia, dated August 5, 1866. "The work in Louisiana is complete. Mother Moses guided us through the darkness as she always has, but this time not toward freedom but toward justice. I do not regret any action taken, though I will carry the memory of that night with me always. Some evils can only be answered in kind. Remember that I tell you nothing of this, if asked." As Dr. Meacham's research became more focused, she traveled to the site of Fontainebleau plantation itself, now privately owned and partially restored as a historical site that, like many such plantations, had sanitized its history for tourism. The current owners had permitted limited archaeological work on the grounds, but had shown little interest in exploring the darker aspects of the plantation's past. The current narrative at Fontainebleau focuses on architectural history and the economic importance of sugar production. Meacham noted with evident frustration, "There's minimal acknowledgement of the enslaved people who actually created that wealth, and certainly no mention of the events of July 1866. With special permission and the assistance of Dr. Marcus Williams, an archaeologist specializing in plantation sites, Meacham conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of areas where contemporary accounts suggested the overseers had been buried. What they found confirmed key details from the historical records: 7 burial sites in a remote corner of the property, separate from both the main cemetery and the unmarked graves of enslaved people. The positioning and dating of these burials match exactly with the accounts," Dr. Williams confirmed in his report. The hurried nature of the burials is evident from the shallow depth and lack of proper caskets. These men were put in the ground quickly and with minimal ceremony, which aligns with the historical narrative of authorities wanting to quiet the matter. More disturbing was what limited excavation revealed about one of the bodies, presumed to be Jacques Martin based on the location. The remains showed clear evidence of a brand mark on the facial bone structure, matching the description in Thomas Whitley's letter. Forensic analysis confirmed the brand had been applied ante-mortem and with significant force, using an implement identical to that described in plantation records for marking enslaved people. The physical evidence removes any doubt about the veracity of the written accounts. Dr. Williams concluded. These men died exactly as described, in manners that precisely mirrored the suffering they had inflicted on others. But no one dared say it out loud, that Harriet Tubman, one of America's most revered historical figures, had potentially led what amounted to a precisely targeted killing operation. The implications challenged the comfortable narrative of Tubman solely as a peaceful liberator, forcing a confrontation with the complex reality that liberation sometimes came through violence deemed necessary by those who had exhausted all other options. The most chilling aspect of Meacham's research emerged not from the historical evidence itself, but from the reaction to it. As she began to publish preliminary papers on her findings, she encountered resistance from unexpected quarters. Several established Tubman scholars questioned her methodology, despite the rigorous documentation. 2 planned presentations at historical conferences were mysteriously canceled. And most disturbing, she began receiving anonymous messages urging her to let sleeping histories lie and consider the greater good of Tubman's legacy. I understood the resistance, Meacham reflected. Tubman has become an American icon, soon to be the face on the $20 bill. Her image has been carefully curated over generations to emphasize certain aspects of her life while downplaying others. My research threatened to complicate that narrative in ways that made many uncomfortable. Yet the evidence continued to mount. Meacham discovered a collection of oral histories recorded in the 1930s by writers working for the Federal Writers Project, specifically interviews with elderly black residents of Louisiana who had lived through the Reconstruction era. Multiple accounts referenced the Night of the Seven Judgments, or when Moses brought not freedom but justice. These oral histories had been archived but never included in published collections or academic studies. According to the witness statement of Jeremiah Carter, recorded in 1934 when he was 92 years old, there wasn't a black soul in 3 parishes who didn't know what happened at Fontainebleau that night. It wasn't spoken of to white folks, but among ourselves, it was remembered as the night when the scales were finally balanced. Mother Moses came not with a railroad that time, but with a sword. The oral histories revealed that within the black community of Louisiana, the events at Fontainebleau had taken on almost mythological significance, a rare moment when those who had inflicted suffering with impunity finally faced consequences proportionate to their actions. Yet this chapter had been systematically excluded from the official historical record, preserved only through generations of whispered accounts. As Dr. Meacham prepared to publish her comprehensive findings, she received an unexpected communication, an email from an elderly woman named Ruth Carver Johnson, who claimed to be the great-granddaughter of Benjamin Carver, one of the 3 former soldiers identified in Meacham's research as having accompanied Tubman to Fontainebleau. My great-grandfather never spoke publicly of what happened in Louisiana, Johnson wrote, but he left a sealed letter to be passed down through the family, only to be opened 50 years after his death. That letter has remained within our family, but your research has convinced me it's time for the full truth to be known. The meeting between Meacham and Johnson took place at the latter's home in Baltimore, a modest row house filled with carefully preserved family photographs and documents. Johnson, a retired schoolteacher in her 80s, presented Meacham with a yellowed envelope containing several pages of tight, careful handwriting dated January 3, 1910, shortly before Benjamin Carver's death. What my great-grandfather recorded was a complete account of the events at Fontainebleau, Johnson explained. He wrote it as both confession and testimony, with the understanding that it would remain private until long after anyone involved could face consequences. The letter began simply, I set down here the true account of what occurred at Fontainebleau Plantation near New Orleans in July of 1866, in which I participated alongside Harriet Tubman, whom we called Mother Moses, and my comrades Isaiah Williams and Samuel Jackson. I do so not in regret, but in the belief that someday the full measure of justice we delivered might be understood in its proper context. What followed was a detailed, unflinching account that confirmed every aspect of Meacham's research while adding disturbing new details. Carver described how Tubman had recruited the 3 former soldiers specifically for their specialized skills, Williams for his medical knowledge, Jackson for his expertise in silent movement and tracking, and Carver himself for his strength and knowledge of restraint techniques. Mother Moses made our purpose clear from the beginning, Carver wrote. This was not to be an indiscriminate attack, but a precise rendering of justice. These 7 men, she told us, have blood on their hands that even the war's end has not washed away. They continue to torment and kill those legally freed but practically still enslaved. If the law will not touch them, then we must become the law. Carver's account described 2 weeks of careful preparation, observing the overseers' routines, mapping their quarters, and gathering detailed information about their specific crimes from those who had suffered under them. Tubman insisted on absolute precision. Each overseer would face a fate that mirrored exactly what he had inflicted on others. The night of July 28th began at midnight. The four moved silently across the plantation grounds, using skills honed during wartime intelligence operations. Each overseer was taken in sequence, starting with those least likely to raise an alarm. Tubman personally led each approach, though the physical aspects of the retribution were carried out primarily by the 3 men under her direction. "I will not pretend we felt remorse in those moments," Carver wrote. "We had all seen too much during the war, witnessed too many atrocities committed against our people. This was not mindless vengeance but calculated justice, delivered with the same cold precision these men had shown in their own cruelties." Most disturbing was Carver's description of the final execution, that of Henri Dubois, the plantation manager who had overseen and encouraged the brutality of his subordinates. According to plantation records Meacham had discovered, Dubois had developed a particular method of punishment he called the complete lesson, in which an enslaved person would be subjected to each of the specialty tortures of his 6 overseers in sequence, often resulting in death. For Dubois, Mother Moses ordered a special justice, Carver wrote. Each of us performed upon him one of the punishments his overseers had specialized in the same sequence he had called the complete lesson. Mother Moses herself delivered the final stroke, using the same cane knife that Dubois had used to hamstring those who attempted escape multiple times. As she stood over him, she spoke words I shall never forget. "Remember their faces as you die, for they will be waiting for you on the other side." Carver's account concluded with their departure before dawn, Tubman heading north to rejoin abolitionist circles, the 3 soldiers separating and making their ways to different states. All had taken an oath never to speak of what had occurred, an oath Carver had kept until his final days. "I break my silence now only because I go soon to meet my Maker," he wrote, "and I believe he will judge our actions at Fontainebleau as necessary and just. We delivered retribution when the law offered none, and in doing so, perhaps allowed the spirits of those who had suffered to finally rest." Dr. Meacham sat silently after reading the letter, its pages trembling slightly in her hands. The document provided the final confirmation of what her research had pieced together, but the clinical detail and lack of remorse it displayed was more disturbing than she had anticipated. "I've spent my career studying how communities achieve justice after systematic violence," she said finally. "Truth commissions, war crimes tribunals, reparations programs, all modern mechanisms that didn't exist in 1866. What happened at Fontainebleau was extrajudicial justice in its most direct form, delivered by those who had no access to any legal remedy." Ruth Carver Johnson nodded slowly. "My family has carried this knowledge for generations. We never viewed my great-grandfather as a murderer, but as a soldier who carried out one final mission against those who had committed crimes with impunity. The question isn't whether what they did was legal. It clearly wasn't, but whether it was just. And that's a question each person must answer for themselves." After 2 years of research and the validation provided by Carver's letter, Dr. Meacham published her complete findings in a comprehensive article in the Journal of American History. The response was immediate and polarized. Some historians praised the meticulous research while expressing discomfort with its implications. Others questioned whether such a chapter, even if true, should be incorporated into the broader Tubman narrative. Most interesting was the response from descendants of those formerly enslaved at Fontainebleau. Following the publication, several came forward with family stories that aligned with Meacham's findings, tales passed down through generations about the Night of 7 Judgments and when Moses brought the final freedom. Marie Baptiste, a 76-year-old descendant of Martha Jenkins, expressed what many felt. "My grandmother's grandmother told this story as one of liberation, not violence." She said that after that night, the remaining overseers at plantations throughout the parish suddenly became model employers. Word spread about what happened to those 7 men, and no one wanted to be next. Sometimes justice has to speak in the only language oppressors understand. The Fontainebleau plantation itself has since become a site of historical contestation. The current owners initially resisted acknowledging Meacham's research, continuing to present a sanitized narrative focused on architecture and economics. But pressure from historical organizations and local community groups eventually led to the installation of a small exhibit addressing the events of July 1866. The exhibit text remains carefully neutral. Historical evidence suggests that on July 28, 1866, 7 overseers at Fontainebleau Plantation were killed in what contemporary authorities described as a coordinated attack. Some scholars have connected these events to wider patterns of resistance against continued oppression following legal emancipation. No mention of Tubman appears in the official display, though visitors often report hearing tour guides and local residents speak in hushed tones about the night Moses came not to lead, but to judge. For Dr. Meacham, the most significant outcome has been the broader conversation about how we remember historical figures in all their complexity. The traditional narrative presents Tubman as almost saint-like in her moral purity, she noted. But the historical Tubman was a multidimensional human being who lived through unimaginable suffering and oppression. Under such circumstances, concepts of justice and necessary action take forms that more privileged people might find difficult to understand or accept. The events at Fontainebleau Plantation remain a historical gray area, documented enough to establish their basic reality, but shrouded in enough ambiguity to allow for continued debate about their meaning. Was this a case of justified retribution in a context where no legal justice was available? A calculated act of terrorism designed to prevent further abuses through fear? Or something that exists outside our conventional moral categories altogether, an act of war continued by other means after the formal conflict had ended? What is certain is that for generations, the story lived in 2 separate spheres of memory, erased from official histories while preserved through oral tradition within communities for whom Tubman represented not just a conductor to freedom, but an agent of ultimate justice. Today, visitors to the remaining structures of Fontainebleau Plantation often report an unusual atmosphere in the former overseers' quarters. A persistent chill even in the Louisiana summer heat, the faint smell of iron that some associate with blood, and occasionally, the sound of a blade being drawn slowly across a whetstone. Local paranormal investigators have recorded unexplained phenomena, including audio that some claim contains whispered names, the names of those who suffered and died under the overseers' cruelty. The most commonly reported experience, however, comes from the fields themselves. Visitors walking among the remnants of the sugarcane rows sometimes describe a sensation of being followed by a female figure who vanishes when directly approached. Those who have glimpsed her describe an elderly woman carrying what appears to be a farming implement, her eyes fixed forward with unwavering purpose. Whether these accounts reflect genuine paranormal phenomena or the power of suggestion in a place now associated with a dark history remains open to interpretation. What seems undeniable is that the events of July 28, 1866, continue to resonate through time, challenging our understanding of justice, liberation, and the complex legacy of one of America's most iconic historical figures. Dr. Meacham continues her research, focusing now on identifying other potential operations carried out by Tubman and her team in the chaotic period following the Civil War. There are gaps in the historical record, periods where Tubman's whereabouts are unaccounted for. She explains, the Fontainebleau incident may not have been isolated. Records from the Freedmen's Bureau contain cryptic references to other plantations where particularly brutal overseers met sudden, unexplained ends in the years 1866 to 1868. In each case, the pattern is similar. Specific individuals known for exceptional cruelty killed in manners that reflected their own methods, with no perpetrators ever identified or prosecuted. We may never know the full extent of Tubman's post-war activities. Meacham acknowledges, much of the evidence was deliberately destroyed or never recorded. But the Fontainebleau incident opens a window into a chapter of American history where the boundaries between liberation and retribution, justice and vengeance, became blurred by necessity. For Ruth Carver Johnson, her great-grandfather's role in these events remains a complex family legacy. He never spoke of regret, she says, but my grandmother told me he would sometimes wake screaming in the night. Not from guilt, she believed, but from the weight of having been part of something so momentous and terrible and necessary all at once. As the sun sets over what remains of Fontainebleau Plantation, casting long shadows across grounds once soaked with the blood and sweat of the enslaved, visitors sometimes report hearing a woman's voice carried faintly on the evening breeze. The words vary in different accounts, but most commonly reported is a simple phrase: justice comes in many forms, but it always comes. Whether the voice belongs to the restless spirit of Harriet Tubman, completing her final mission, or merely to the wind stirring memories that refuse to be silenced, is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. What remains undeniable is that on a hot July night in 1866, the reckoning that had begun on battlefields across the South reached its most personal expression in the darkened rooms of 7 men who discovered, in their final moments, that freedom had come to Fontainebleau Plantation not through legislation or proclamation, but through the edge of a blade wielded with terrible purpose. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond our own, 7 overseers perhaps still face the judgment of those they tormented, while Harriet Tubman, Moses, liberator, spy, and perhaps executioner, watches with the same unwavering gaze that guided hundreds to freedom and 7 to their final accounting.